when you build team as you're scaling Chatmeter and other companies, what are the key challenges and the things that you learn are helpful to the other companies out there to think about their teams and structures and growth?
Yeah, it's things have definitely changed, and I think things have changed materially over the last 2 years. Since the pandemic, and the idea of A, building teams, and then B, scaling them has sort of evolved and morphed over time. And the one thing that has remained fairly consistent, though, over the course of whether we were at PayPal, where we were a much larger company, or at a smaller organization where I am right now at Chatmeter, is building a culture of collaboration and collaboration across not just the product function, but across all functions. So that's super important because, and it's becoming more and more important now because we're not in the same room and solving problems on a whiteboard all the time. While that happens once in a while, it's not always the way the problems are solved today. So having that culture of collaboration from day one, I think, is quite important. And as companies scale, that's the one thing that typically drops off. While the intentions are always positive and people always want to be collaborative, it's not that that people are necessarily averse to it, but it just becomes more subconscious, right? You're sort of like, oh, I sent an email, so I guess things happened, and or actions are getting taken, or I sent a Slack message and something happened. While that is true, I think it also leads to a lot more tactical focus, and you end up sort of resulting in the immediate, in what needs to happen now, what needs to happen the next hour or the next day, as opposed to balancing that with what needs to happen in the longer term. So, and in order to have effective growth and scale teams, you need to look at a balance of the two, which leads to the second part of this. So how do you sort of then plan for this? And it reminds me of a very kind of quote that sort of sticks in my mind. And I kind of have seen it attributed to a lot of people, but I think it was originally by Lord Kelvin, and then Peter Drucker, and then John Deming. But essentially what it says is, if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. I mean, it's not a new quote. It's just that's what it is. I mean, the reality is, when Lord Kelvin, back 200 years ago, when he was, doing chemistry and working on the gas law, great. I mean, that's fantastic. But he needed to measure it. And in science, it's very obvious. But it's harder to do that when it comes to building teams and scaling for growth. So one thing I found fairly effective is making sure that the teams, as they grow, have a fundamental set of KPIs that everyone's marching towards and measuring. Right. And the team itself is not just at the product level, but everything needs to sort of roll up, right? So you have the situation where you have the product team, and then that then relates to the business metrics, and then to the corporate metrics, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a good way to start. I can talk more about it, but I think you got a question.
Yeah, that's actually, you touch upon so many very interesting topics. So I'm just going to dissect and then pick some of them specifically I think could be very interesting to some of our audience, and also just very interesting for my experiences when I just chat with you. The interesting thing, one of them, is that even though we were distributed, and then we were actually working differently in the context distributed, meaning that you have sort of the capabilities in group, and then you have another capabilities in another location. So it's almost like the APIs of components that they're talking to each other has a lot less. You have more defined sort of the function, and then you just use the API to work with the function. Today, like, not only the functions say not like in the past. So for example, we work at a PayPal, we have like a product managers in one location primarily with all the other PMs, and some engineers in one location, some engineer in the other location, and then we have a business partners, let's say in another country. So we do have like sort of distinctive sort of the connection points, and it's less frequent because the PMs work a lot closer and every day working together. So in this today's environment, what you mentioned is like, you know, not just COVID, even like slightly before COVID, we already start to have like a PMs in multiple locations, engineers in multiple locations, so that the API model doesn't work anymore. You can't just do like end of day in sync or just once a time in sync. So I want to just kind of go back to you on that, because what I noticed is that when that happened, the people trying to reduce complexity, then they just created a quote unquote agile team, a scrum team, a pod. So the pod started to have a relatively smaller number of communication, right? You have a product manager, maybe a designer, a couple of engineers, and then you work in that pod, and then you have relatively less interaction with the rest of the company or other pods, just, you know, because that it's more convenient, right? But that obviously leading to some other problems. So we have seen is that one is the pod may shrink and expand in need. Like you in this pod, let's say, owns certain areas of product. That areas of product sometimes needs a lot more work, sometimes needs less work. And similarly to the other pods. So then you become a little bit challenged because there's no way to have both the visibility and the juggling between them.